Mardle presents The Boy Who Sat by the Window, written by David Hodge and read by Luke R. Francis. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Mardle. Foreword. Dusty is a strange bird, it's fair to say, and if there is such a thing as self-deprecating confidence, she has it. Even in the early days of my noticing and befriending Dusty, there was already an edge to Dusty. The makeup was so carefully done and ridiculously precise, and then you had the fashion drag. Not drag, but full-on, high-fashion Vivienne Westwood in totality. She's been everything. Door whore, DJ, pop star, artist and writer, and now, damn it, a book which was preceded by a podcast. With this book, you see Dusty laying out her past and walking towards the future, or even just the now. Dusty's life has not followed an orthodox path. She's not the queen you think she is. She's more. She's complicated. She's bitchy. She loves gossip. She pretends not to care, but wants it all. She is deliciously Midlands-ish. She is freak royalty. I remember watching Dusty talking to Pete Burns one night at the Nag Club and just thinking, look at those two ridiculously beautiful things. My children, my sisters, queers, weirdos, fashion junkies, show-offs, attention seekers, freak royalty. Enjoy this story. I already jumped to the parts about me. Boy George. Prologue. I murdered her in the middle of Trafalgar Square. The whole thing was carefully planned. It would be witnessed in plain sight by thousands of people, though none of them would realise what they were seeing. It would be her last, dazzling appearance. The smell of the grease paint, the roar of the crowd, all that had sustained her for so many years. Then, once the spotlight had been switched off, the deed would take place. No fuss, no bother, just silently in the shadows, the sudden, swift flash of the blade. But before that shadow moment came, there would be this final blaze of glory. I owed the old girl that at least. She'd done a lot for me after all. So the last glimpse her public would have of her must singe the retinas and impress itself there forever. What would make it even more memorable was that for some time now she'd been living in semi-seclusion. Not, like Norma Desmond, in a crumbling mansion on Sunset Boulevard, but in a basement council flat in King's Cross. Nor had she even been a tangible creature anymore, existing only on the racks of shimmering dresses, on the wig stand, in the makeup boxes among the eyebrow pencils, the foundation and the lippy. But now all of this would come together in a glorious swan song. For one brief, shining moment, she would live and breathe again. Her Mr. DeMille moment was upon her. She was ready for her close-up. Since her public hadn't seen her for a while, there was no way she would emerge from the basement flat looking like some raddled old harridan. In Trafalgar Square, when that close-up was 20 foot wide on the big screens, the crowd was going to gasp in wonderment. So the preparation would be punishing. Merciless months of early morning runs, hours in the gym, a ferocious diet till the pounds of overindulgence were shed and she was back to being a size 12 again, just as she'd been aged 18. £1,000 was spent on a wig alone, a blonde extravaganza that channeled Eva Peron rather than Norma Desmond. The gown, a masterpiece of brocade, velvet, rhinestones, and worth a small fortune, would be hidden at first beneath a sweeping cloak, which would then flutter to the ground to reveal the goddess underneath. But most important of all, as it always had been, would be the face. On the day, and as she had done for the past 25 years, she sat down in front of a mirror and, for 4 solid, painstaking hours, performed the ritual of turning herself into what she wanted to see. It was a ritual of technical skill, artistry, and even of magic. For that quarter century, it had been this act of transformation which had excited her. The thrill of it equal to, perhaps even surpassing, the applause and attention which she knew the end result would bring. She could not do all of this entirely alone. Great ladies had always required the assistance of maids for their toilette. To shoehorn her into the corsets which would provide the infinitesimal waistline desired, to thread the expensive silk flowers into the wig, to generally bill and coo and tell her how absolutely fabulous she looked. But now, the passing of time had dulled the thrill of the transformation, and the small world in which she had moved had itself moved on. So it was time to go. The party was, for her at least, nearly over. But not just yet. And within that small world, this was the biggest party of the year. At the foot of Nelson's column was a huge stage, and behind it a large tented area, crammed with the big stars of its firmament. None of it fazed her in the least. She'd done all this 100 times before, and today she'd do it again. When she arrived backstage, the desired effect was achieved. Heads turned, jaws dropped, and flash guns flashed. Wow, look at her. Even if some younger people weren't totally sure who she was, they could tell she was somebody. She talked to the press. Where had she been, they asked. What were her future plans? The usual banality. She told them she was here to say goodbye, that after today she wouldn't return. But they didn't believe her for a moment. You'll be back, they told her. You'll never give this up. She smiled sweetly and said nothing and let them take their photographs. She took a glass of champagne and then the moment came. Lifting the cloak and the gown off the floor, she stepped carefully on her 6-inch heels through the tangle of cables and sound equipment. Somebody announced her name and she walked out onto the stage. And there were few stages anywhere in the world to rival this one. The facade of the National Gallery straight in front, St. Martin in the Fields to the right, Landseer's Lions on either side, and the two great fountains playing in the middle. And all those faces looking up at her. 10,000, maybe. At the sight of this vision, magnified on the screens, a huge cheer ricocheted round Nelson Square. They knew a star when they saw one. Soon, as always, she had them in the palm of her hand and under her thumb. When anybody jumped into the fountains, she ordered them out and out they came. If anybody heckled, she heckled back better. She'd always been known for her sharp tongue, and time hadn't blunted it. As the song went, good times and bum times, she'd seen them all and was, emphatically, still here. For the next few hours, she strutted her stuff in the hot midsummer sun. The objective the same as it always had been. Trying to make sure everyone was having a good time. Putting a bit of sparkle and glamour into daily lives which might well be dull, deprived or difficult. But on this one day of the year, it was more than that. On this one day, a community which could still face marginalisation at best and oppression at worst took charge of the very heart of the capital city and made it their own. Loud and proud and 2 fingers to anyone who didn't like it. And then the show was over. Looking out at the rippling field of faces, she told them to remember that they were all one family. Black and white, gay, lesbian, trans, non-binary, or whatever the hell else they might want to be. She told them they were all incredible and amazing, and she meant it. And then she took a bow. Backstage, there would be more partying for a while. The flash guns still popping, the eager young faces still jostling to be photographed. And though the great square would gradually empty, the clubs and bars would stay full for hours yet. Soho, that iconic place in which she had spent so much of her life, would scarcely sleep tonight. But now she wanted none of that. It was time for the shadows, and she slipped quietly away into them. A taxi was found, and before it had gone more than a few blocks, the assassination began. The 1,000-quid wig came off, buttons and corsets were loosened. There was no need for perfection now. All of that was done with. In the basement flat in King's Cross, the magnificent dress and the cloak were carefully removed and returned gently to the boxes of tissue paper. The high heels and the padded bra eased gratefully off with a long sigh of relief. And there I stood in my bathroom, a naked man. Only on my face did she still exist. I ran a bath full of bubbles and sank into it. I let the warm water soothe from my body the marks of the corsets and the dress and the high heels. And then, with nothing more than soap and water, I washed her off my face. I'd gone through that process so many times before, but this would be different. This time, I was washing her out of my life. I felt some emotion, of course. As I said, the old girl had been good to me in many ways. She made me famous, albeit within that small glitterball of a world. She'd certainly made me a lorry load of money in her day, and I could still see the faces and hear the roar of the crowd in Trafalgar Square. But she'd also brought me unhappiness, distorted values, and had obscured, behind the sequins and the sparkle, the person I really was. So I felt no guilt at killing her off, and I would never mourn her. I got out of the water, now streaked with the diluted residue of her powder and paint, her lotions and potions, and watched her go, literally, down the plug hole. The sense of relief was overwhelming. Because if it hadn't been her, it might have been me. Slowly but surely, it had become a question of survival. "Are you okay?" asked the person that I loved. "I'm fine," I replied. I got into bed and slept like a baby. Rest in peace, Dusty. 1. The view from the window was not inspiring. A stretch of scruffy grass, drab school buildings opposite, the backs of the identikit houses in an adjacent street. A canvas devoid of colour, of interest, of hope. But it was to be my fate to be made an outcast and to sit alone by that window for nearly a year. Most of us have childhood experiences that mark us for life. That was mine. I envy those with rose-tinted memories of their early school years, but mine are as dark as a pair of Anna Wintour's sunglasses. It started on the very first day at nursery school. I was 4 years old, hysterical and begging my mother not to leave me in this strange place, which smelt of cabbage and of other children I didn't know and didn't want to. In this world, there are people who need to learn how to bite, or, to be precise, bite back. Sometimes they're people who belong to minorities, racial, sexual, economic. Sometimes they're people who, for whatever reason, were never taught to value themselves. Often, though, they're just a bit different from the norm. And that's enough to make them a target for abuse, physical or mental. So, if you turn out to be one of those, you eventually learn that, to make life bearable, you need to bite back. I was one of those people. Much later I'd learned to do it with my tongue, but on that first day, I actually did it literally. A teacher called Mrs. Wollaston was trying to prise me, kicking and screaming, away from my mother's legs, so I bit her on the hand. She never liked me after that and didn't bother to hide it. Those teeth marks paved the way for a miserable, lonely time at school, and for my lifelong struggle to make myself accepted and liked. But Mrs. Wollaston was just the warm-up act for a teacher we'll call Miss Pinchface. I'm changing her name in case the awful cow might still be alive, sitting in some care home, watching afternoon repeats of Midsummer Murders, and I've no wish to add to her woes. There are other false names I might choose: Cruella de Vil, Lady Macbeth, and some not printable. But let's go with Miss Pinchface, because that's how she always looked. No sign of any enjoyment of life, certainly not of being a teacher. Oddly enough, she was quite young back then. Maybe she'd had a rotten childhood herself and saw nothing wrong in making sure that other kids did too. I've often thought that everyone who seriously thinks of becoming a teacher should look at themselves in a mirror and ask themselves some very hard questions. Do I really like children? Do I understand them? Do I genuinely want to bring out the best in them and set them on a course for a happy and successful future? If you don't, please go and do something else, because the harm you can do is incalculable and can scar lives forever, as Miss Pinchface scarred mine. For reasons I'll come on to, I coped with my earliest years by creating a fantasy world. Many troubled children do this, and it's usually harmless unless it slides over into the real one. And that was my mistake. After seeing the film Born Free, about a lioness called Elsa, I created a scenario where my father had got a job as a game warden in Kenya, and we were all going to live in the bush. I'd convinced myself this was totally true and shared the good news with Miss Pinchface, who, for once, seemed interested in me. That afternoon, when my mother came to pick me up, Miss Pinchface made a beeline for her, and my fantasy was immediately uncovered. Mom just rolled her eyes, but the next day Miss Pinchface took her revenge, calling me to the front and telling all the other kids about my amazing future in Kenya. "Isn't that wonderful, everybody?" she asked the class. Oohs and ahs came from the rows of little desks as they struggled to picture me in khaki shorts and a pith helmet. "There's just one little problem," said Miss Pinchface, her thin lips pursed tight. "Can you guess what that might be?" Silence. "The little problem is that it's all a complete tissue of lies. Not a word of it true. Lies, lies, lies. And what does that make David Hodge?" "A liar," came a voice. "Correct. It makes David Hodge a nasty little liar. And what do we do with liars?" "Punish them," said another voice. "Correct. We punish them. We teach them a lesson." And that was what she proceeded to do, though much more than even she perhaps imagined. So I was moved to that side desk over by the window, looking out over the scruffy grass, tarred and feathered with the label of liar, cut off from the others as if I had the plague. During the long, lonely months of my exile, Miss Pinchface said hardly a word to me, unless to find some reason to scold or shame me in front of the rest. Nor was I allowed to join in any group activities, as she claimed I was also disruptive. The other kids followed her lead, and I was rarely invited to join in their games. I was a small, sad, 7-year-old pariah. At the time, mercifully, I didn't really understand how evil all this was. In those times, it would no doubt have been seen as justified. Today, she'd probably be sacked for her persecution. Anyway, it didn't work. In fact, just the reverse. All it did was to push me further and further inside the bubbles of make-believe that throughout my life I would always use to shield myself from things I found unpleasant. If the outside world didn't want to understand me, I would make my own reality. So, sitting at that window, staring out at the bleak canvas of a dull Midlands town, I painted other pictures of worlds more exciting and glamorous than this one, of how I'd one day make my mark, of people who'd accept me and value me. In time, in ways beyond even my imagination, I'd achieved much of that. But in the darkest corner of my mind, however hard I fought back against it, I would always be the boy who sat by the window. I still am. 2. I remember the day they took the animals away. I can still see the big trailer swallow up my father's horse and my sister's ponies. I can still hear the panicky neighing of the horses and the sobs of my siblings. My mother's prized possession was more easily hidden, a collection of Dalton figurines which she'd managed to ferret away somewhere before her porcelain shepherdesses could be seized and added to the list of saleable assets. The bailiffs and debt collectors had landed on our doorstep and repossessed everything we had, including the doorstep. Our large, lovely farmhouse near Lichfield was gone too. Being too young for ponies and other such luxuries, what the bailiffs repossessed from me was the vital childhood sense of safety and security. Not long before, my father had been declared bankrupt after his family tiling and kitchen business had collapsed. To say that we went from riches to rags would be slightly melodramatic, but not far off. Though unable to understand just how bad things were, I somehow sensed that nothing would be quite the same again. And it never was. There were 5 of us. My parents, Clive and Jean, my older sisters, Karen and Julie, and me. We were a Midlands family born and bred, and, apart from me, still are. Lives spent in and around Walsall and its satellite towns and villages. My parents had been each other's first and only love, but they had a funny way of showing it. Except it wasn't funny for their children. They argued constantly, passionately and very loudly for most of their years together. Their relationship could go from freezing cold to boiling hot in a matter of minutes. Consequently, their 3 kids grew up to believe that shouting and screaming was the norm, that all family life was like a scene from Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. I don't remember actual pots and pans being hurled, but every insult and expletive certainly was. My father Clive was a man of excesses. He worked hard, had been highly successful at first, and tended to do everything big. He went hunting and shooting with the local nobs, drove a Bentley and bought a racehorse, which proved to be a duffer in every race it ran. My sisters went to the best schools in the area, while I rode around the farm on a little electric buggy and played with the ducks and the chickens. The house always seemed to be full of people, parties, music and corks popping. Unfortunately, my father was particularly susceptible to popping corks, and, as his business ventures gradually hit trouble, he hit the bottle. Just as I would later turn out to do. Dad always fled from reality if he could. Somehow he managed to hide all of this from my mother, so that when disaster finally struck, it came as a terrible shock from which I don't believe she ever entirely recovered. Suddenly, without warning, the days of wine and roses were over and she faced a return to the near poverty of her early life. Jean had been brought up in Walsall, which was, and still is, a tough industrial town blighted by deprivation. Her father had died when she was 15, and she'd had to sew knickers in a factory for 9 hours a day. Later, she'd gone on to be a nurse, but then she'd met and married the ambitious Clive Hodge. Bye-bye to the bedpans and bandages, hello to the big house, the Bentley, the parties and the ponies. But then, in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake up, it was all gone. Snakes and ladders. In Jean's case, the bottom of the snake was all too familiar. After being thrown out of the farm in Lichfield, we all moved to her mother's house in a run-down area of Walsall. We literally had nowhere else to go. As is often the case, the people my father had helped or employed in the good times completely turned their back on him. Worse still, his own mother and his 2 brothers, all of whom were both financially comfortable, did nothing to help us. No doubt all these false friends still went to church on Sundays and considered themselves loving Christians. Nana Edna's house was like stepping back into post-war England. It was tiny, with no central heating. The only warm spot was in front of the fire in the sitting room. The bedrooms were freezing. Mom and Dad moved into what had been Nana's bedroom, and she reluctantly moved into a box room scarcely bigger than a cupboard. My sisters and I shared a single bedroom with 3 little beds crammed in. The only toilet was a dystopian shed out in the garden, inhabited largely by monstrous spiders, the sight of which certainly helped the bowels to move. The fact that the house was next door to a huge cemetery did little to add to its cheer, though the dead were probably warmer than we were. As a 4-year-old, it was something of an adventure, and I made the best of it, as kids do, amusing myself in my self-contained world. One day, Nana Edna came into her teeny garden to discover that I'd cut the heads off every single rose. "What in God's name?" she spluttered. "Where are my roses?" "In there," I replied, pointing to a bucket of water filled with petals. "I'm making you some perfume." What could she possibly say after that? I'd often remember it in the future when squirting myself liberally with Chanel or Yves Saint Laurent. The child is the father of the gay man. But I wasn't too young not to pick up on the stoic misery of my parents. My father went about with failure hanging over his head like a thundercloud. There was the element of blame too, of course, and my parents' rows became real humdingers that could be heard halfway down the street. Dad would often say he was leaving us forever, then go out and return even more shamefaced and drunk as a skunk. This was the beginning of the growing alcoholism, which would throw an all-consuming shadow over all our lives till the day he died. Despite this, Dad did his best to build a new life for us all. He got a job as a lorry driver, and my mother went to work as a cleaner in a care home. My sisters settled into a new school, though much less prestigious than before. A small degree of stability returned. So a little money came into the house, but it was still a house of cards. You always felt it wouldn't take much to blow it down. "Kissed with fire," said Nana Edna, ruffling my flaming red hair. "You're kissed with fire." With my parents out at work and my sisters at school, I was left at home with her during the day, listening to her Max Bygraves records on an old gramophone. She loved bloody Max Bygraves. To this day, I still remember the words to Tulips from Amsterdam and You Need Hands. Though she lived in a humble house on a small pension, Nana Edna always made the best of herself. She was still quite a pretty woman, wore powder and lipstick, and every week had her pure white hair set, returning with subtle shades of blue, pink or violet, a transformation which I'd begun to find very interesting. Nana tried to paper over the widening cracks in my parents' marriage by taking me out to the Walsall Arboretum, followed by lunch at the Golden Egg, where she'd make do with a cup of tea, while I ate egg and chips and a strawberry milkshake. "Don't you like egg and chips, Nana?" No, love. A cup is enough for me." I only understood much later that her pension would only stretch to the one meal and not two. She even encouraged me to draw and paint, though money was too tight to provide the proper equipment, so I'd just use a biro pen and doodle on the backs of old Christmas cards. Nana Edna had a large tribe of sisters, whom she often took me to visit. One sister had a sofa still covered in the plastic it had arrived in, as she didn't want it ruined. Another had a tortoise in a greenhouse with which I became obsessed. I'd sit quietly listening to these game old girls reminiscing about the good old days when they'd all lived together in a terraced house and taken turns in a tin bath by the fire. Even at that age, the good old days didn't sound that great to me. Their memories were certainly on another planet from those I had of our big house with the Bentley and all mod cons. Nana Edna was never overly affectionate. She certainly hadn't been so to Mom as a child, which probably explained that toughness at the core of her daughter. Yet I knew Nana loved me, and I adored her in return. She was a second mother, the sort who believed that family always came first, a belief she'd certainly proved by taking in her devastated daughter, her drunken son-in-law, their 3 young children, not to mention 3 messy dogs. In fact, she didn't even like to mix socially with people to whom she wasn't related by blood. It was a definite eccentricity, but we were all the grateful beneficiaries of it. At our lowest ebb, she'd given us all shelter, support, and unquestioning love. The little she had, she'd shared with us without thinking. Later in my life, when I came across unkindness or selfishness in people, including myself, I'd sometimes think of Nana Edna and try to reconnect with the sheer goodness and quality of spirit that she embodied. Nearly half a century later, at the launch of the first exhibition of my paintings, I remembered her, the biro pen and the old Christmas cards. Despite all the troubles and self-doubt in my life, I'd somehow always clung on to Nana's faith in me. kissed by fire, she'd said. Eventually, after much hard work, my parents saved up enough for the deposit on a rented house of our own, back in the small town of Aldridge where I'd been born, and where we'd once lived before moving to that money-guzzling palace near Lichfield. Aldridge was a quiet, fairly well-heeled place near Walsall, full of retired conservative people with neatly mown lawns. It was a spacious house with a big back garden and a huge oak tree to which Dad tied a tyre on a rope to make me a swing. I spent hours spinning and twirling on that rope, spinning fantasies out of gossamer, still lost in my inner life. Looking back, I don't think we could really afford that house, but at least it allowed my mother the illusion that things were getting better. We lived there for 5 rocky years, during which there were constant rows about money, plus a long list of other things for my parents to scream about. The rows could go on for days, and only end with one of them slapping or hitting the other. Not nice for children to witness. But Clive and Jean never bothered to hide this misery from their kids, and we were overexposed to the language and passions of the adult world long before we could properly understand it. During these years, my father's boozing grew increasingly apparent. The poor man was obviously going through some sort of nervous breakdown, which nobody recognised or diagnosed. "For God's sake, get a grip on yourself," my mother would shout, as he sat there pissed as a rat, his head in his hands, rocking to and fro. "You've got 3 kids and a wife," she'd yell. "You're a man. Start acting like one and pull yourself together." One time, I found him passed out on the grass near our house. "Dad's dead! Dad's dead!" I screamed, running indoors. "Get an ambulance!" Awful for a young boy to experience, but in retrospect, Dad was just a desperate man with a young family to feed who'd lost everything he'd worked for, his dignity most of all. My mother was equally desperate, not to return permanently to the poverty she'd grown up in, and she just couldn't understand the fragility of his emotional state. Only the rich got much help with mental health problems back then, and though we tried to disguise the fact, the Hodges had now come down in the world with a bang. In 70s Britain, there was no Prozac, no cognitive behavioural therapy or mindfulness. It was, get a grip, be a man, pull your socks up, stiff upper lip. Poor Dad. By escaping from reality into the bottle, my father just gave himself a dangerous addiction that would prevent him from ever changing that reality. Double whammy. When he was pissed, he was a different man to the loving dad I adored. Once, he gave away my highly prized ventriloquist doll to one of his boozing buddies. Another time, he ate an Easter egg I'd been saving up for the occasion. Small things, but huge crimes in the eyes of a 5-year-old. There were many more examples of him undermining my trust in him. I was never sure which father would be coming home from work, the amazing one or the drunken one. It was confusing and destabilising. He always seemed to let us all down when we needed him so much to be strong. Naturally, I still worshipped him. When he was sober, he was indulgent in a way my mother never was. If I wanted chocolate, he'd buy me a huge bar which I ate till I was sick. When I wanted a pet mouse, he let me have hundreds of them, housed in special tanks in the garage. He'd take me for long walks in the countryside, teaching me about the flowers and the animals. To my mouse menagerie in the garage, I soon added guinea pigs, hamsters, and even a grass snake called Hector. Eventually, my mother freaked out when the mice got into the house and ran across her when she was in bed. The exterminators came the next day, and I never saw the mice again. "Mouse murderer!" I yelled at her, and sulked for days. I think Dad indulged us because he realised that his mental state wasn't strong enough to be much of a father, so he tried to compensate with kindness. Neither then or as I grew up did he ever reprimand me or punish me. He seemed incapable of setting boundaries for his children because in his own life he had imposed so few on himself. So Dad, at least when sober, was the good cop and my mother the bad. But the stresses on her, strong as she was, were enormous. My father went from one low-paid job to another, and her fear of becoming homeless returned. She'd somehow managed to squirrel away some of the beautiful furnishings from our old farmhouse to make our rented home look good and hide from the prosperous neighbours the truth of our impoverished state. The house was always immaculate, smelling of wax polish and shaken vac, and my sister's school friends were discouraged from coming round in case it caused a mess. There were no birthday parties or sleepovers at our address. I guess her compulsive tidiness reflected the need to have at least one aspect of her turbulent life under control. She worked hard all day, cleaning at the old folks' home, then came home to clean some more. No wonder she was often too exhausted to play with us or ask about school. Instead, she showed her love by battling to put food on the table, the roof over our head, clothes on our backs, and, above all, by trying to keep my father sober. Luckily, this lack of mothering was compensated for. Apart from Mom and Nana Edna, I had a third, Julie, the younger of my two sisters. Though only 4 years older, it would often fall to Julie to babysit me when our parents were out working, cooking me beans on toast and keeping me amused. She was clever, artistic, and as kind as anyone you would wish to know. When it was all kicking off between my parents downstairs, she'd get into bed with me and reassure me that everything would be okay. She'd read me stories and, like Nana Edna, encouraged me to read and write. She was patient, kind, and seemed to understand me. Knowing that I had almost no friends at school, she invented one for me. An imaginary chum called Icky Bicky, who spoke in a baby voice and would only come to see me when I touched Julie's front teeth. We'd have long conversations with Icky Bicky, and I totally believed in the reality of his existence. I'd nag her endlessly to let him come and talk to me till, no doubt bored shitless by the whole nonsense, she broke the sad news that he had died and wouldn't be coming to see me anymore. I cried my eyes out. How ironic that my first experience of genuine loss should be to a non-existent friend. My other sister, Karen, 8 years older than me, was the archetypal angry teenager. She'd had the very best of everything as a child and was probably more traumatised by the removal of all that than Julie or me. Like all of us, poor Karen was suffering, but far from silently. Her shouting and screaming nearly as scary as that of my parents. As she grew, she started going off the rails. Boys, drinking, taking the pill, all the usual stuff. She threw crockery and stuck a knife into the centre of my mother's prized mahogany dining table. She hit a boy with a piece of wood and was taken to court. And one day, the tweedy neighbours rushed out onto their manicured lawns to watch my father literally dragging her, kicking and yelling, back into their house as she made another bid for freedom. Full of anger and disdain for everything and everybody, the polar opposite of my loving Julie, my older sister seemed to hate my very existence. We never had fun or played together. We hardly even spoke. My first clear memory of her was when, in Nana Edna's little house, she stood up in our shared bath and urinated down onto me. Not surprisingly, I've never been close to Karen and never will be. It's just not true that blood is thicker than water. Without love, the blood is curdled and meaningless. So, Clive and Jean Hodge and their 3 children were all, to a greater or lesser extent and in their different ways, troubled souls. For us kids, this perhaps derived from one factor above all the others. Though my parents loved their children, their primary emotional involvement was always with each other. Each was the stormy centre of the other's world, and their children were unconsciously sidelined. Collateral damage. They may have laboured all hours to look after us materially, but emotionally we were left to fend for ourselves. The tempests raging around us always seemed to trivialise our needs and magnify those of our parents. Our fears and feelings, our hopes and dreams weren't really on their radar. My sisters and I wanted that kind of attention and rarely got it. Looking back now, I see quite clearly that, for the rest of my life, I would be trying to find it. 3. "Of course," said Mr. Bullock, delivering the school's obligatory birds and bees lecture, "there are exceptions to the norms of reproduction. Such people are called homosexuals." He was standing behind me and, as he spoke, patted me on the head 3 times. In that moment, he destroyed me. Mr. Bullock was my science teacher and, like most other people, appeared to have a problem with my existence. Like Miss Pinchface, he seemed to hate me at first sight and never missed an opportunity to make sarcastic remarks to or about me. Bullock was a good name for the sort of man he was, probably in his 40s at the time, and with a penchant for flirting with the teenage girls he taught. His bubbling dislike of me came to a head on Birds and Bees Day. There was nothing in his spiel most of us didn't already know backwards, and I was drifting off into one of my bored trances. When he got to the male and female make a baby bit, he wandered close to me without my noticing. Then the podgy hand landed on my head and made those 3 pats, like a pope giving a blessing to a pilgrim. Yet this wasn't a benediction, but a crucifixion. A crucifixion in the form of the cruel laughter which now swept towards me, knocking me over with shame and embarrassment. But Mr. Bullock hadn't finished yet. "These unfortunate people," he declared, "are destined to lead sad, miserable, and lonely lives." He walked away from me, seemingly oblivious to the fact that he had just obliterated what little confidence I had in myself, and humiliated me in front of my peers, which, for a teenager, is just about the worst thing you can do. I was gutted, and sat there in red-faced silence. Still desperate for attention, both at home and at school, I'd suddenly got it in the most dreadful way. As Miss Pinchface had exiled me to the desk by the window, Mr. Bullock had now exiled me from my peers by different means. Like her, he'd nowadays be fired for the way he treated me. Like her, he was a teacher who damaged children rather than nurtured them. Over the years, I'd often liked to imagine that macho Mr. Bullock was subsequently arrested for cottaging, or, better still, that he'd discovered one day that a child of his own was gay and that he'd had to face up to that and deal with it. Sad, miserable, and lonely. I could have wept at those words, and I seem to remember that, once safely in private, I did just that. Devastating as it was, I suppose Mr. Bullock's pronouncement was hardly necessary. He certainly wasn't the first person to make it. Back in nursery school, about the time Miss Pinchface had sent me to the desk by the window, I'd become aware of not being quite like the other little boys. I wasn't interested in the stuff most of them enjoyed: football, cricket, or pretending to kill people with toy guns. I hated all sports and didn't even want to learn to ride a bike. My parents had bought me one, but I was too scared to remove the stabilisers for years, till my mother blew her fuse. "Oh, for God's sake, Clive, teach that boy how to ride that damn bike properly." By this time, I guess I'd become increasingly effeminate. I was far more interested in playing with Julie's dolls, drawing pictures and playing with my toy animals. I'd also become very interested in my mother's wardrobe. I'd wear her fur coat and dance around in her high-heeled shoes. I'd pin on her false hairpiece and put on all her jewellery in one go, playing ladies in her bedroom. I sensed by the disapproving looks and comments that I should keep this pastime private, so I started to wait till she'd gone out before indulging in these first cross-dressing games. Julie, however, was all for it. She loved dressing me up, and once persuaded me to go over to our neighbour's house and introduce myself as my own female cousin from America. God knows what they thought when this bizarre vision appeared on their doorstep. "Howdy, folks. I'm Peggy Sue, David's cousin from Chicago." Actually, that's not true. I can imagine exactly what the neighbours thought, and of course they were quite right. And naturally, everyone else around me had come to the same inescapable conclusion. "I'm not sitting next to you," said a boy as we gathered in the school hall for assembly. "You're a puff." "What do you mean?" "My big brother says you're a puff," he replied, "and that I shouldn't sit close to you or it might rub off on me." With that, he got up and moved away. At that time, I had no idea what a puff was or how one acted. I suppose I should have asked somebody or looked it up in the dictionary, but I didn't. Soon the name-calling spread and I was officially designated as the school puff, accustomed to being called the dreaded word every day. I began to learn when to keep my mouth shut and to sense when to move away from situations that would lead to me being mocked, kicked or punched. I'm quite sure that the teachers were aware of what was going on, but in the 70s, no guidelines from Stonewall existed for them to manage the situation, even if they'd wanted to, and I suspect few of them did. So they ignored it and let me sink or swim. Of course, as I grew, the full meaning of being a puff finally dawned on me. I'd been born in 1967, the very year that homosexuality had been partially decriminalised in the UK. But it's far easier to change a law than to change social attitudes. In the 70s, it seemed to be perfectly acceptable to say whatever you wanted, however nasty, however publicly. Comedians like Bernard Manning mocked gay people, black or brown people, fat people, the disabled, all women in general, and anyone else they could get a cheap snigger from. Puffs, in particular, were an easy target. We were still freaks and weirdos, to be pitied at best, vilified at worst. The only gay people portrayed on TV or in the media were camp comedians like Larry Grayson or John Inman in Are You Being Served? Nowadays, in far more liberated times, we laugh with these characters, but back then, they were laughed at. Even those celebrities whom we'd now say were obvious rarely came clean about their sexuality. The late great female impersonator Danny LaRue pretended that cross-dressing was just his act, though it seems crazy that anybody ever believed it. Nor did the great actor Dirk, star of pioneering gay films like Victim and Death in Venice, ever really leave the closet in his lifetime. Who did these guys think they were kidding? So back then, being gay was rarely mentioned, and certainly not by anyone I knew. Even before the boy in assembly refused to sit near a puff, I'd known that I was different from the rest. This sense of exclusion wasn't helped by my flaming red hair. Nana Edna's lovely compliment that I was kissed by fire was turned into an insult. Carrot top, ginger nut, and a lot of far nastier things. All of which made me feel even more of an outsider than sitting alone by the window already did. But in parallel with the negative stuff associated with being a puff, a more positive thing was beginning to happen. One which would dictate the future course of my life to an arguably greater extent. Even by the age of 7 or 8, I was beginning to develop an interest in my appearance, or, as I'd call it grandly in the future, a sense of my personal aesthetic. The fact that my parents were always short of money contributed to my exclusion at school. To save cash, my mother always knitted my school jumpers herself. They were beautifully crafted, but I was always aware that they looked homemade and very different to everyone else's plain grey C&A jumpers. I would beg her not to make me wear them, tears and tantrums, but to no avail. However, I drew the line when I was told to wear a pair of brown baby sandals, probably a hand-me-down from some relative. Round toes with a buckle. Oh, hideous. It was the 70s and everyone was starting to wear platform shoes. I'd seen a pair of chunky wedgies in the local shoe shop and I lusted after them. Sure enough, when I arrived at school in the baby sandals, the teasing started at once. I was told they were girls' shoes. My toes were stamped on. I was still back in Miss Pinchface's class at this point, and the bitch didn't hide her amusement. Agony. So, I worked out a plan to get those platform shoes. That night on the way home, I scuffed the toes of the sandals against a wall till there were holes in the leather. I sneaked back into the house and found my old school shoes, the only other pair I had apart from pumps. I threw these over into next door's garden, which left only the pumps as alternative wear to my now ruined baby sandals. The next morning, I came down in the wrecked sandals and my mother went ballistic. "Jesus Christ, what on earth have you done? Do you think I have money to burn on new shoes? Get upstairs and put on the old ones." I pretended to search for them, and then she tried too, but they were, of course, somewhere among the neighbours' dahlias. Now late for work, she sent me to school in the pumps, which elicited a sharp note from Miss Pinchface, instructing her never to send David to school again in pumps. My mother, red with anger, ordered me into the car, and we drove at supersonic speed to the shoe shop, due to shut at 5:30. There, I was made to try on a very ugly pair of black school shoes, which was not the result I wanted at all. The platforms I wanted so much were right there on a shelf. I could almost smell the leather. If I didn't get them, I felt sure I would die. So I threw the biggest hissy fit of all time. I lay on the floor. I screamed and shouted. I threw the ugly black...